And joining us now here on the Jay Stevens podcast, it is Kendall Kaut. He covers the Baylor Bears basketball team for SB Nation. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, Kendall. How you doing today?
Doing well, Jay. That was pretty close, and we were good to go. Don't think the last name will come up again, so happy to roll and talk with you today.
Good. It's good to hear, man. First thing people think about right now with this season with Baylor basketball is their long COVID pause. Now, I went back and looked at their entire schedule. This isn't the first time they have missed consecutive games or any games throughout the season. It's just this is the first time they have missed this many games in a row. With Baylor having so much time off, what do you think their approach will be coming up tomorrow as they get back on the court?
Jay, that's a good question. Obviously, with the first game being Iowa State, that gives them a little bit of help that your first opponent back is not KU at their peak or Texas or one of the Big 12's best teams. I think they will continue to play kind of how they have in the past. We don't know definitively who might be out or what the minutes restrictions might be. One example of that is Oklahoma with Brady Manick when he first came back was only playing about 10 minutes a game. So that'll really be the question for them is there is kind of a pretty big drop-off in the front court if one guy's gone, but the backcourt's been, I think, pretty healthy during this pause. So I would expect Baylor to look similar to how they played. Lots of threes, lots of good guard play, and then if the bigs are down, you just hope to survive those minutes.
During this off period, and I've seen University of Michigan when they came back and played Wisconsin, and then they played, I forget who they played second, then they played Ohio State just yesterday. The first 20 minutes of play when Michigan came back, they were kind of doing what I expected, them feeling themselves around, trying to feel out their opponent, and just trying to get their legs under them because they hadn't played in over 20 days. Similar thing for Baylor. What are you expecting in the first half when they play Iowa State?
That's a great question. I think they'll be pretty good. They could make me look really stupid about that. There was a study done by this guy named Evan Miyakawa, I think is how you pronounce his name. He's got a site called evanmaya.com, and he's found that teams are about 2.6 points worse when they have a 21-day-ish pause. So Baylor could be a little bit worse in this contest, but they didn't play very well in Ames against Iowa State. That was probably their worst performance of the season. Still won pretty handily because Iowa State, not real good.
Right.
Steve probably is going to be looking for a new job next season with how bad things are in Ames. But I would expect a pretty good performance because one staple to Baylor basketball is when they don't play very well, they tend to take it kind of personally and really get bothered by it. So I think they'll play very well against Iowa State. And I don't think that's a team they would underestimate. I think K-State, if they play them in the Big 12 tournament, which is very unlikely with how bad K-State is, that might be the only team left on the schedule that Baylor would say, these guys are clowns. We don't care about the matchup. But absent that, I would expect a pretty good performance against a bad Iowa State team.
So kind of like this guy's getting into their pride and saying, we know what happened the first time and we're too good to like lay an egg, and just kind of showing up and just playing their best basketball. Is that kind of what you're saying right now?
Yes, Baylor basketball very much embodies that ethos that I think some athletes have where they look for any slight or any perceived attack on them. Earlier in the season, Jared Butler had mentioned that he thought Gonzaga was getting a lot of hype compared to them. He certainly respects Gonzaga. But he was like, I just don't know that we get as much respect as we should. And the reality is that I think everybody in the country that's not a moron recognizes that Baylor and Gonzaga and maybe now Michigan are in a tier unto themselves. But they take these slights very personally. I think they'll look at the Iowa State game, probably find a few tweets in the first half where people are like, is Baylor really good? Power them. When the reality is, if it were me, I'd say, no, people get that I'm great. If I were as good as Baylor is at basketball, I'm not. But they use those to fuel them, and I think they'll continue to fuel them, Jay.
You mentioned Jared Butler, and you wrote an article this morning talking about his improvement, what he has done, where he's improved. And you spent a lot of time talking about him on the defensive end from sophomore year to junior year with the young age that he is and how he just improved his play on both ends, but primarily on the defensive end. If you could go in depth in talking about Jared Butler, your article, and what you've seen and the improvement that he has shown this season.
That's a great setup, Jay. I think defensively it comes down to really two narrow components. The first is kind of that same mindset I had mentioned where Jared Butler, I believe, talked to 24 NBA teams over Zoom during the NBA draft process before he elected to come back to Baylor. One thing that stuck out in a lot of the interviews he mentioned to me over the summer is they just said, look, we don't know if you're being hidden defensively because they think you're a bad defender, or if you're just not taking these assignments on, or if because Davion Mitchell and Mark Vital are such good defenders, if they're just not playing you there. So we came into the season kind of embracing that challenge. As a result, he's made film study on the defensive end a much higher priority than it had been in seasons past. Baylor played Auburn, where Sharif Cooper might be a lottery pick. I have a little bit of a question about whether that's something that should happen given that Sharif Cooper's not the tallest man in America and he can't shoot, but clearly a phenomenal basketball IQ and a superb passer. But Butler came into that game, and Davion Mitchell did as well, trying to limit his effectiveness. There's one play where he kind of hops, stops, and then is able to use his arms. So I think it's the combination of the basketball IQ that he possesses and a diligent work effort where he works much smarter than he did in the past, where there's this kind of component in life and in everything else where it's if you put in 80 hours a week to your craft, you must be doing better than the guy who works 40 hours a week. When the reality is, if you just work smarter, sometimes that's better than working harder. And Butler is working so intelligently this season. I talked to 4 graduate assistants with the Baylor program, and that was kind of a common theme that he comes in, he knows what he needs to do, he gets it done, he leaves, and then he's ready to go in the future. So he's very diligent, he's prepared, but he's not a moron saying, if I work 100 hours, I'm better than the man working 50. He's the man saying, if I'm working 50, how am I working better than the man working 100? And he's doing that.
You know, there are a lot of people in America that would love for you to say that to their bosses. Like, bosses like, oh, work 80 hours. You're like, no, the person that's working 40 hours is more efficient. If you could relay that to numerous managers and bosses in America, you may have a lot of people on your side and saying, hey, pay this man millions of dollars. He has the key to success.
Jay, I love that framework, and I totally agree with it. I think that most of the time, if America switched to like a 25-hour work week, we could be more productive. But in America, I fear that dream may never come.
It would be nice for you and I both. It would be very, very nice, but I doubt it will as well. I recently looked back at KenPom. They put up the rankings. I think this was a couple weeks ago for the Player of the Year rankings, and they had Jared Butler at 2. Luka Garza, number 1, Jared Butler, 2, Trace Jackson Davis of Indiana, 3, Drew Timme of Gonzaga, 4, and then Ayo Dosunmu, number 5. In that rankings there, do you think that's an accurate description or display of how the players have, those 5 players have played this year? I know you primarily do Baylor, but you may dabble into some national player rankings with as good as Baylor is nationally and with as good of a player Jared Butler is.
So, Jay, that's another great line of questioning. I think it's a philosophical question there.
Yes.
Garza is very much a guy that the case, I think, begins and ends with Iowa would be horrendous without Luka Garza. You watch their team and you look at the guys they're putting on the court and you just kind of watch them if you didn't have the sound on, and you'd look at them and you'd say, man, how does this team win any games with this dude on the court, without this dude on the court? But you also, I think if you wanted to be kind of the contrarian to Luka Garza, your take would be Iowa still is not of the tier that Baylor, Gonzaga, or Michigan are at with his play. And then if you watch this man play defense or watch the guy run, I see him as NBA, and I'm like, man, I wonder if he's good enough to play in Spain professionally because he just can't move laterally. And it is a testament to what Luka Garza is offensively that he's still number 1 on KenPom, but he really can't defend. And they're not taking Jared Butler out of the game with 4 minutes left to do an offensive-defensive sub. They're not taking Ayo Dosunmu out of the game to do an offensive-defensive sub. So that is really my attack on Luka Garza, is that he's the kind of player that if you did take him off of Iowa's team, they'd be much worse than if you took Ayo Dosunmu off Illinois, or if you took Jared Butler off Baylor, or Drew Timme, Corey Kispert, Jalen Suggs, pick your Gonzaga men. Certainly, there would be a difference there. But kind of with the NBA MVP as well, back when the franchise out in North Carolina, I always forget if they were the Hornets still back then, or I think they were the Bobcats back then, when they were just god-awful with Al Jefferson. It was like, well, if you took Al Jefferson off that horrible Bobcats team, they would be, instead of a 20-win team, they might win 4 games. So is Al Jefferson your MVP? It's like, no, he's not your MVP just because the Bobcats would be complete trash instead of the garbage is overflowing levels of trash. But I think that I would give the award to Butler or to Sumu because I think they do more for their team on the ends of the floor than Luka Garza does alone. I don't fault anybody that votes for Luka Garza because you watch him play, as I know you have, Jay, and he scores a lot, and scoring is the most important component in a basketball game. But to me, you can't be my player of the year if they sub you out defensively and if your team's not a top 5 team. But I might be a little biased because I just interviewed Jared Butler in that category. But I don't have a problem if you give Drew Timme or Jalen Suggs or Corey Kispert the award. I just think my national player of the year can't get subbed out in the most important parts of the game because he can't defend a moving mailbox. And I don't know how a mailbox is moving, but with Luka Garza, you look for new analogies for how he can get blown by because he gets blown by a lot of ways.
That's an interesting assessment and statement you just made because I do cover Ohio State for the Locked On Podcast Network, and Ohio State played Iowa, I want to say a couple weeks ago, and then they play Iowa again, I want to say this coming Sunday. in latter parts of the game was close, it was tight, two good teams battling, it's bound to happen. And I noticed that Fran McCaffrey, he subbed in 4 younger players for defense. When the offense needed a score, the starters came back in. Luka Garza goes out for when it's defensive time, comes back in when he needs to score. It's very, very rare that when I watch TV, I don't do much watching a TV national stuff anymore. It's all very much like sugar sticky, and they kind of just like trying to fill space, trying to make you feel good. I'm like, no, I want some substance to what you're talking about. And it's rare somebody mentions that Luka Garza on the defensive end is not the guy people want him to be when you're thinking about the National Player of the Year. And I do watch him when he runs. You're saying I've heard people say, "Oh, he's a first-round pick in the NBA." Excuse me. I don't know what kind of NBA basketball you're watching, but he's winded in college basketball, and he's not playing NBA minutes, NBA style, the up and down style, the free flowing. He's not playing that. Big Ten basketball, yes, the Big Ten regular season it's tough. I'm not gonna lie to you, it's a tough gauntlet. But even then, the Big Ten basketball season itself, I don't think it's as good as it used to be as far as top end talent, middle talent, lower end being such a grind and a battle. I've seen better Big Ten basketball play years ago. So this isn't the best that I've seen, but people are falling in love with Luka Garza. And Kendall, I think it possibly is. Baylor hasn't played in 20-some-odd days. Iowa and Luka Garza have been. They've played in big games. They've had big wins. And so he's getting that TV time, that airtime that Baylor hasn't got. And it's interesting, even though KenPom has Jared Butler at 2, I wonder, Kendall, if Jared Butler and KenPom's rankings would be moved up to number 1 if he had played those games had not been canceled.
I think that's definitely a possibility. Baylor was ahead of Gonzaga when the cancellation or the delay happened, Jay. So Gonzaga's now moved ahead by like 2 or 3 points in the rankings because they've had the opportunities. And that's kind of hurt Baylor, is that Butler's not out there playing a bunch of games. So I wouldn't have a problem if somebody voted for Io or Suggs or Kispert or Timmy and said, look, Baylor just didn't play as many games. There's something challenging about playing this many games. But at the same time, I think, though, Jay, this presents a unique opportunity for Butler because Baylor's probably going to play 6 games in the next 2 weeks. And if they win the Big 12 tournament, they might play 9 games in 3 weeks. And if Jared Butler can emerge 8-1 or 9-0 and easily win Big 12 Player of the Year, that's a lot more impressive than anything Luka Garza does, because I got one more rant about him just because I never get the chance to rant.
Go ahead, man. Go ahead.
Quite my guy. When people talk about recruiting rankings, they're normally very good, but Garza was like 312th in the country. I at least understand why people watch Luka Garza play high school and college basketball and maybe thought this guy's not going to be good, because you watch him play, the dude just cannot run. Like I don't understand it. Like I sometimes hear about guys in baseball that they'll say, yeah, we had to teach him how to run a little bit better to be a sprinter. I don't think you can teach this man to run. I think he's just a phenomenal college player. I wish him the best in the NBA, but I don't think the NBA is going to be wishing him the best, because I don't think it's going to be more than a summer league appearance before they say, you got to be able to run in the NBA. The man can't run.
Well, I wonder, sticking on Luka Garza real quick, I wonder if him shaving maybe 10, 15 pounds, getting some of that baby fat off of him, maybe trimming up and losing some of that body fat, I wonder if that will assist him in running. I don't know. I'm not that expertise. I'm not that scientist, not the medical guy that says, oh, here's your X, Y, and Z, or here's your ABC 1, 2, 3 steps to be able to run better. I personally don't know. But when I see him, it's very heavy-footed. He's struggling. And against teams that will run up and down, or teams that may slow it down but will bruise him and battle him down low, it's going to be a struggle. And it's amazing. I'm not going to lie to you. It's amazing with Iowa's offense and the amount of scoring that they put up, that he is able to run the way that he does and be as effective as he is on the offensive end, because his running is a problem. You mentioned KenPom's team rankings. Gonzaga is 1, Baylor 2, Michigan 3, Iowa 4, Illinois 5, Houston 6, then Ohio State 7. So those are 1 through 7. If you want to round out the top 10, Alabama 8, Loyola Chicago 9, who I think may surprise some people in the NCAA tournament coming up, and then Virginia number 10. Among those teams there, we just witnessed and watched just yesterday Ohio State, Michigan battle. The only time in the regular season that those two teams will battle. I know what you think about Gonzaga. You've already mentioned that Michigan might be in that tier. But do you think that it's Gonzaga, Baylor, maybe Michigan? Do you think it's a possibility that Ohio State, if they run the table, could fit in that top tier of college basketball teams? Or do you think it's kind of solidified that Gonzaga, Baylor, possibly Michigan could be there in the rest of the country?
Right. I think that, Jay, that's another great question. I think that it is very similar to the 2005 season where Illinois and North Carolina were clearly teams. But they're also, I think, maybe the second most comparable season to this one would be 2015, where I thought that Kentucky and Wisconsin were a tier above everybody else, but yet Duke won the title that season. I think Michigan, Illinois, and Ohio State kind of slot into that next level together. My take on that top 10 is that Virginia is kind of fraudulent.
Mm-hmm.
Gonzaga was the only team that played them that had the kind of talent and athleticism at that same level that Baylor, Michigan, Ohio State, and Illinois, and some of the other top teams you might also put in the top 10 will present, and they just couldn't do it. And I think that's kind of what their challenge has been lately, losing barely to Duke. And that's why Gonzaga, I think, might fall down a bit, is they're really propped up by just eviscerating completely Virginia. And I think that Virginia's frauds. But I do think that when I look at that Michigan, Ohio State, Illinois tier, from Baylor's game against Illinois, I still have a big question about how does Illinois defend teams that can put Kofi Coburn and ball screens all day because he runs that drop coverage. I think that presents an issue for them. They could win the title if just Io gets very hot that second weekend of the season. They're good enough to just make the Elite Eight on talent alone. And then if you only have to win 3 games, maybe Io gets hot enough for 3 games that it doesn't matter. And they're kind of champions like Connecticut did in 2014 when they got going. I think Ohio State has the potential to do it. Michigan obviously shot out of their minds in that first half, and that may not be replicable. My biggest concern with Ohio State, though, was when Michigan cooled off in the second half, they still had trouble getting some defensive rebounds where I thought they were in pretty good positions against Michigan. So that's maybe a question I have. Having not watched the Buckeyes a ton, that's kind of my first experience really in depth with them. But that makes me a little questionable about are they in that same tier. But if you look at a lot of the champions over the last 10 years, I think they're better than both UConn teams that won the title. And so I think it would be more like a step up from UConn winning the title if Ohio State or Illinois won it. I think if Michigan wanted to be kind of similar to 2015 Duke, where they're very good enough to do it. But I think Baylor and Gonzaga are in that Illinois, North Carolina tier where one of those teams is clearly the best. Gonzaga might have just a slight edge with more games right now. But I think one of Baylor or Gonzaga should win the title. But in a single elimination format, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody else won it. Maybe Iowa shocks us all since we've been railing against them, Jay, but I don't think the Hawkeyes are going to be the team.
No, I don't think so either. I think that, honestly, the Big Ten tournament, where I do think Iowa will probably get a round or 2 bye, where the first game is not until Thursday, and they'll play Thursday, Friday, possibly Saturday. If that happens, 3 games in 3 back-to-back days, Luka Garza by day 3 might be gassed. And I'm not trying to, yes, we're being critical. That's what we do here with sports. We're critical. We follow these sports. But I do think Luka Garza will possibly be gassed. Ohio State and Michigan might actually – I think they might meet prior to the championship game if that actually happens. In a round 2, I think you'll see more energy and effort from Ohio State. Ohio State was also down one of their key contributors off the bench who does play a lot of really good defense. And I think some of those threes that Michigan made in the first half – they would not have made them because it would have been more better on-ball defense. Now, Michigan was swinging the ball around, moving it around, and they were just on. You can't deny it. But one key defender missing it, I do think that would have been a difference maker in that game. Back to Baylor basketball. We talked a lot about Jared Butler. Who are some other players, maybe people listening to the podcast, that may say, I never watched Baylor basketball, or I did a little bit earlier in the season. I was looking forward to the Gonzaga and Baylor game, which ultimately got canceled. I want to know more about other players on Baylor that are good, so when the tournament comes on, I can say, oh, Kendall talked about that guy, and he's showing up big in this moment.
Yep, Davion Mitchell is the guy that sticks out there. Yahoo's NBA draft actually had him as a lottery pick.
Oh, wow.
Mock. I think that might just be a little bit high because Davion is going to be older than 22 on NBA draft night, and generally point guards that old don't get picked in the lottery. But he's got a really good shot to make it in the first round. He appears as a first-round pick on ESPN's mock draft now as well. He worked on his three-point shooting a lot this offseason at Auburn as a freshman and then in his first year of eligibility at Baylor. Didn't knock down triples at quite the rate he wanted, made some form changes, and he works out a ton. Is now shooting 45% from beyond the arc. He's one of the fastest players in the country, an incredible defender. He was a finalist for National Defensive Player of the Year last season. Him or Mark Vidal, also a guy who sticks out for Baylor in his 5th year on campus. I think Mark Vidal's 24 years old now, so a really old guy who plays defensively phenomenally. He's only 6'5", but plays center in a lineup that I refer to as the 5-0, where Baylor will switch all ball screens. That's been their most effective lineup. So Defensively, Mark Vidal's who you should look out for. Offensively and defensively, though, Davion Mitchell's been an absolute revelation this season. If Baylor kept playing games, he played at a level high enough to earn first-team All-America honors. I don't think Gonzaga or Baylor will get a second guy on those teams because of how deep the top players are in the country this season. But Davion Mitchell's played at a level that he'll at least make one of the All-America teams.
I want to end with this note. You mentioned something very specific. Now, this isn't Baylor basketball, more looking ahead to the NBA draft. There was a time that a junior, a senior, fifth-year senior, 21, 22, maybe 23, wasn't a problem for draft analysts or draft scouts or executives to say, yeah, he's been at school for a little bit, 3 or 4 years. He's seasoned. He's seen a whole lot of basketball. He's been starting for 2, maybe 2.5, 3 years. And we know what we're getting. There has been a trend in recent years where the 22-year-old is too old. We want an 18-year-old, but the 18-year-old is taking 3 years to get acclimated to the NBA. So you would have been better off drafting a 22-year-old. In your own assessment of and just thought process when it comes to the NBA draft, how would you look at the age specific of these athletes? 22 too old, 18 just right, somewhere in between. How do you look at the age that a player should be when he goes to the NFL if you were an NBA scout?
Sure, Jay. I think it kind of comes down to specific guys. And if they're year of elite player, it's probably going to be the 18, 19-year-old. My take on this draft is that I think Evan Mobley is a future superstar, and I would take him number 1. I think Jalen Suggs, I'd have to go number 2. Mm-hmm. Cade Cunningham, I think he's going to be a high-quality starter. I don't see the superstar level potential, so I take him 3, though, given the age. But I think once you move beyond that, there are plenty of examples of the NBA moving too far the other direction, where Damian Lillard fell in the NBA draft a few years ago when he was 22, coming out of Weber State, because people thought that maybe Austin Rivers, with his young age and how he was good at 15, might mean more. But I think when you get a season of college basketball, you have a pretty good feel for where might guys elevate themselves. And if you look at some of these guys, some of their ceiling at 22 is, I'd want him to be as good as Davion Mitchell is at 22. And so that's where, once I kind of get into the mid-lottery to the late first round, I'm less of a kind of project guy in the NBA draft, unless it's a guy like Michael Porter, where it literally is, can the man still dunk? When he was in that season at Mizzou, where he couldn't really dunk against Florida State in the tournament. Yeah, you take a risk on Michael Porter at 12 if you're the Nuggets, because he still might be a superstar level player. But beyond that, if I like one of these teams and I'm down to Jalen Johnson, who didn't have a very good ending at Duke, or Davion Mitchell, I'm probably going to take Davion Mitchell, because I don't think the ceiling is quite the roof for Jalen Johnson, but I think it might be a pretty high floor for Davion Mitchell. So I think middle of the draft teams should take more of a chance on these seniors and juniors who have performed pretty well. Like DeAndre Hunter's now doing well in Atlanta, where his first year wasn't the best, but 24 DeAndre Hunter's a lot better than the 20-year-olds, because you end up, being the Knicks, where you have a lot of Kevin Knoxes and not as many DeAndre Hunters if you just keep drafting these 18-year-olds at number 6 who aren't that good. So that's my take, is that top 5, I want the freshmen. Beyond that, I got to be pretty certain. Otherwise, I'm going to start drafting guys that are a little bit older and just have quality rotation pieces.
Kendall, I lied. I know I said last question, but this is one that I meant to mention earlier, but it spaced me. It's down at the bottom of my page, which is probably why it went past my eyeballs. Our Daily Bears. I know SB Nation has a clever way to figuring out the way that they're going to name their sites. Where does that, I have my own thoughts, but I don't want to say it. Where does that name, Our Daily Bears, come from?
Sure. So, Jay, I appreciate that question, because we don't get that question a lot when I come on these sites. I just say Our Daily Bears, and I'm like, I wonder if people kind of get that. So the site was started back in 2012 by a guy named Mark Seymour, who's also an attorney as well. He kind of stepped back from the day-to-day role when he's got kind of some family and legal obligations to take care of, legal in the good sense for him, not the
good
trial on a murder or anything. But it came from, because Baylor's a religious institution, give us this day our daily bread. It's kind of a pun on that. Bears are the mascots for Baylor. So that was the moniker, Our Daily Bears, for that one. So that's the history of the name.
I like to always find out the history of the names. I had a guy on from Gonzaga last week, and he talked about how they got theirs. The slipper still fits for their name, for their site. So I was like, hey, well, I can't go anywhere because I like the creativity the SB Nation does. Kendall, this has been fun, man. Do you have any last comments about Baylor basketball, what you've seen, maybe looking ahead, projecting the future, NCAA tournament? Any lasting comments about the Baylor basketball team?
Sure, Jay. And I want to say that this was the best in-depth questioning I've ever gotten from a kind of national podcast that deals with Baylor basketball. A lot of specific stuff, good questions. You really prepared, read my article. I really appreciate the heck out of that, Jay. My kind of final takeaway is that I think Baylor's ceiling matches Gonzaga's. The hope is, can they get to that ceiling? That's why it's good now. I also think that with the positives they've had, Baylor's one of the teams most well prepared for the tournament if something gets out and causes a problem. So hopefully they can, as John Rothstein says, stay positive, test negative. I'm hopeful, though, that Baylor is kind of in that good spot now with how many positives they've had. We won't get a delay. So I'm optimistic about the future of Baylor basketball in March.
Kendall, this has been fun, man. Let people know where they can connect with you. And also, stop real quick. I appreciate the kind words. I do my best to try to prepare and at least sound intelligent. And you're so much information in your head. You want to make sure that the thoughts come out thoroughly so that you and the listener can properly understand what the thought that's trying to get across in the question. So I do appreciate those kind words, Kendall. But let people know where they can connect with you via social media, the site, or maybe connect with Our Daily Bears on Twitter, all that good stuff.
Yep. So, Jay, my Twitter is just my name. So it's KENDALLKAUT. Mainly tweet about Baylor basketball, occasionally offer some political takes, but not too many that anybody from any side of the aisle would probably get too angry at me right now. And then ourdailybears.com. We provide coverage of Baylor basketball. I've been at every press conference this season. I've attended quite a few road games. So we like to think we provide pretty good basketball coverage there as well.
Kendall, this has been fun, man. Really appreciate it. Baylor gets back on the basketball court on Tuesday, and I sure hope everyone listening enjoyed Kendall providing his great insight to the Baylor Bear basketball team. Kendall, appreciate you coming on the Jay Stevens podcast.
It was an honor, Jay. Thank you.